There's a concern right now that the FDA has been influenced by Big Pharma in such a way that they're going to remove from the marketplace all of the new dietary ingredients that were introduced after October 15th, 1994.
They've also tried to institute maximum dose levels so that dietary supplements sold above a certain dose level can only be available by prescription.
The FDA uses its power to censor and disallow truthful claims about the value of nutritional supplements.
The dietary supplement industry is under siege by the FDA. Drug lobbyists do not want the American public to have access to low-cost, totally safe nutritional supplements that compete with pharmaceuticals.
The FDA uses Gestapo-like tactics when it decides to take action against a dietary supplement company or a food company.
We have 100,000 armed federal agents, many of them working for the Food and Drug Administration, and we see that those agents are engaging in behaviors that are reprehensible.
They started walking around, they drew their guns, and I'm like, why are you drawing guns?
The raid on Rossum involved no less than 5 government agencies. In the past 3 years, there have been at least 8 government raids across the U.S. involving raw dairy.
The U.S. Food Safety and Modernization Act would give the FDA more money to hire agents and begin arresting small organic gardeners, raw dairy farmers, people who provide food to local farmers markets.
Are we going to be forced to consume GMOs and chemically laced food and milk with recombinant bovine growth hormone? Are we going to have to eat animals with antibiotics? And the answer is you already are.
You could be violating laws you don't even know exist.
The FDA is truly a rogue agency being run by rogues from industry, government, academia.
The drugs that are approved in this country are not always approved based on scientific data. They're approved based on who has the right political connection.
It's obvious that the Food and Drug Administration should be subjected to a real house cleaning by outraged families who've lost their loved one.
There are many drugs that the Food and Drug Administration has approved that are unsafe, at least too unsafe for the FDA's own medical reviewers to agree that they should be on the market.
Rather than have confidence that a drug approved by the FDA is safe and effective, we now have to wait for millions of people to take it and to see what kind of reactions they have in the real world.
Vioxx has killed at least 60,000 Americans. Increase in heart attack risk was over 500%. And yet the drug company making Vioxx covered that information up.
Where there's criminal activity by executives of drug companies, they frequently get away with paying a fine and have no major disruption of their enterprise.
They're spending $6 million a day on lobbyists in Washington, D.C. alone.
FDA receives 40% of their budget from drug companies. They're hired guns, and they're out there serving the best interests of the company. They do not represent the American public.
The FDA, in my opinion, has probably killed more Americans in this country than all the wars that the U.S. has ever fought combined.
About 100 years ago, things were really beginning to change in the United States. We were changing from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. Titans of industry really wanted to be able to control the world financial system as a whole. When the Rockefellers took over the allopathic medicine, there were many types of medical education in the United States. There were homeopathic doctors and there were naturopathic doctors who were using natural medicines to heal, and they were having very good outcomes. Once the Rockefellers took over the system, they closed down those other schools and they only promoted the sale of their drugs, they promoted surgery, and they promoted radiation. The Rockefellers were also in charge of the oil industry and the chemical industry, and they also made an alliance with a huge German concern called IG Pharma, which was a big chemical industry in Germany. The Food and Drug Administration was started in the 1930s, and it was sold to the people of the United States as an agency that was going to protect its food and drug supply. And of course, in the early part of the century, people wrote about some of the terrible things that were happening with the meatpacking industry and in the food industry in general.
Patented drugs were being advertised all over. And then there were, nostrums were considered secret formulas. And there usually were proprietary formulas. So they got all these addictive drugs in there. And they weren't even listing them on the label. So people were thinking heroin and cocaine, morphine and other types of opiates. And they weren't being told that they're even on the label. So they forced a labeling.
There was a lot of mischief going on in the food industry, and the FDA was set up to correct that problem. They evolved into regulating drugs, medical devices, and at this point they regulate just about anything that goes into the human body.
In the 1930s, 1938, the FDA became a monster. And from that point forward, it has grown by leaps and bounds until the 60s, when it acquired jurisdiction over both safety and efficacy of drugs.
Then in 1938, they passed a law under Franklin Roosevelt defining a new drug, safe and effective for prevention, treatment, mitigation of disease, whatever. The FDA basically appointed itself as the experts. Senator Estes Kefauver sponsored an amendment that was passed, expanding the authority of the FDA to go beyond the safety of new drugs to the effectiveness of new drugs. And that was signed into law on October 10, 1962 by John Kennedy.
At that point, the FDA was largely captive of industry. The FDA does no clinical testing of drugs itself. It relies entirely on submissions made to it by the drug companies. This would appear to the average person to be a gross conflict of interest, and in fact it is.
There is no question that by design, Big Pharma and the pharmaceutical corporations responsible for drugging the United States public have destroyed the lives of children and adults as well in this country. 50% of everyone in this country, everyone listening right now, will be diagnosed with a mental illness in their lifetime, and 1 in 10 Americans overall will be put on some type of psychotropic or antidepressant drug in their lifetime. And Dr. Group, tell us about this total insanity, this attack on the mind of the country, the mind of the planet right now, that is desensitizing us, making us like zombies. I've experienced it firsthand. I don't know if you have. You literally are in a trance all day long, and you cannot bring yourself to be inspired or care about anything with passion.
Well, one of the things that led me down this road of doing research was the fact that we're having so many suicides right now. And if you look back, I mean, there's so many kids and adults and military personnel that are being put on psychotropic drugs. And psychotropic drugs, the definition is just a drug for mental illness or some sort of an antipsychotic drug. What Big Pharma did, working with the Psychiatric Association, they developed what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness. Now, this lists all the potential mental illness diseases like seasonal affective disorder and depression and anxiety and all the things that there's no proof. There never has been any proof that any of these things existed. And to this day, there's no scientific proof. And as a matter of fact, when you go back and you look at how they came up with these disorders, they sat around in a room with other psychiatrists and came up with and invented these disorders so they could drug the population.
Yet it's still called the Bible of psychiatry.
It is.
And it's worshipped by the psychiatrists and psychologists who look at this and try to diagnose people. They use the DSM, the book you just talked about, that says questioning authority in any capacity, questioning government is a mental illness, feeling lonely, feeling sad, it's all mental illness. So every single person can be diagnosed as crazy, just like every single person in this country, if you pay with cash, if you look at someone funny, you can be considered a terrorist. So we're all mentally ill terrorists, basically, according to the government and the Bible of psychiatry.
Exactly. It's because there's no blood test that needs to be run on anybody. There's no x-rays, there's no MRIs, there's nothing. All that needs to be done to prescribe somebody a drug is when you walk into the office and you say, I'm feeling depressed or something like that, and then you get a drug. So it's a perfect scenario for pharmaceutical companies to capitalize on. What's happened is the DSM went from DSM-1 all the way up to DSM-5. The current DSM has 374 mental disorders in there, 943 pages. What's disturbing, though, is they now have a DSM for 0 to 3, which means they're able to diagnose mental illness in children from 0 to 3.
Age 0.
Age 0 to 3. The reason why they were able to do this and gain success was because they were able to classify mental illness as a chemical imbalance in the brain. Although they could not prove that, there was a scientist that came up with that theory. So all mental illness is classified under the chemical imbalance theory. It's never been proven to this day.
So you could basically say that this is opinion-based medicine, but it's worse than that because it's not just opinion, it's cash-based. They're profiteering from this, so they have incentives to diagnose patients as mentally ill so that the big pharma drug corporations that sponsor them and pay them for speaking engagements through backdoor deals are going to make more money. It's total insanity.
Exactly. They want every single person in the United States and in the world on some sort of psychotropic drug. It's a $330 billion industry. If someone is labeled with mental illness, they're not capable to vote. The voting powers have been taken away from them. Their money has been taken away from them. All of their rights have been stripped from them because they've been classified with mental illness.
And they can almost classify all of us with mental illness. They can classify literally 100% of people.
Yes, they can classify 100% of the people with mental illness. So here are just some of the statistics. Not one single person has ever been cured from psychotropic drugs. Psychiatry is designed to keep people sick, addicted, violent, suicidal, drugged, and dumbed down. There are 2,000 side effects associated with psychotropic drugs, and they usually make the condition you're being treated for worse, not better. 100 million people worldwide are on psychiatric drugs. 70% of the drugs are now prescribed by general practitioners and physicians, so you don't even need to go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist anymore. You see the ad on TV that says, ask your doctor about this. And then you go to your doctor and they prescribe you the medications. What's sad is there's screening in schools now. It's called the Teen Screen. And the Teen Screen is a questionnaire that teens fill out in high school or even middle school that asks them questions about, do you feel lonely from time to time? Are you happy from time to time? Just very simple questions. Do you feel depressed one day a week or something like that? Well, right now, most teens, by the time they're 18, have gone through, from the time of 0 to 18, have gone through up to 12 mental illness screenings that go on their record forever. And 9 out of 10 kids are prescribed a drug after they take the teen screen. 84% of kids that took the test were falsely labeled as depressed.
So 90% get actually diagnosed.
Yes,
take a drug.
After the teen screen test has been performed.
And that means that not only do they hear a commercial or whatever in some cases and go to their doctor and ask for it, and the doctors are handing it out like candy, but they're actively going out and mobilizing to give kids the drugs and diagnose them.
They're going out and mobilizing teams to do screens. They're even doing screens now in OB/GYN offices for pregnant women because they know their hormones are up and down all the time. And
so this is an aggressive marketing
This is an
campaign.
aggressive
This is like actually a sales tactic 101. To give someone a screening test, then they think they're diagnosing themselves, so they're more likely to actually purchase the product, in this case, a drug.
This is a
sales technique.
Covert marketing and sales technique that's been going on and is getting worse and getting worse to create mental illness and to classify every single person as being mentally ill and never addressing the root cause.
If they can do that, then they can pioneer all these new drugs.
And they can control you, and they can always label you as having a mental illness. If anything goes on, they can threaten you with, you were diagnosed or you showed signs of mental illness, you've been screened for mental illness and you were positive. But what's happening is 23 soldiers and veterans are committing suicide every day now, more than that are killed in combat. 716 people out of every 100,000 commit suicide that are on psychotic medications. Psychiatric drugs now are killing an estimated 3,000 people every single month, so there's population control efforts there as well. 17 million children worldwide have been prescribed psychiatric drugs. Out of the 17 million, more than 10 million children are in the United States.
So statistically, of that, thousands of them will kill themselves.
thousands of them will kill themselves. What's sad is that you're seeing kids that were completely fine. They went to the doctor. They had a screening done. The counselors told the parents they needed to be on antidepressants or psychotic medications, mind-altering medications. And they were on there, and some of them within 7 days have committed suicide, and the parents found them hanging in the closet.
The real crime is that in the 1980s, Eli Lilly knew that Prozac was worsening suicidal thoughts and causing more depression and everything, and they hid it. And it wasn't until, I think, 2005 through a BBC article that this Harvard, I think it was a psychologist or a psychiatrist, he came out and said the human population was being treated like guinea pigs, and that they had hid it all these years. And Eli Lilly was forced to admit that. They had hid it. So they know what's going on. That is the true crime here, is that they're giving people with suicidal thoughts and deep depression these drugs that worsen it. And the side effects even admit that. And all the shooters are on them. All of the totally insane people are put on these to make them even more insane for money. And statistically, you're going to have people that are killing themselves, and it's growing, and it's thousands of people now. That's just insane, but go ahead.
And here's the thing, it's so hard to get somebody off antipsychotic or psychotic drugs because you have to slowly wean them off for at least a year. And then you have to replace and address the root cause. So
you can do it naturally with herbs and everything.
You can do it naturally, but again, the root cause of this is not being addressed. The root cause of, if you want to say there really is such thing as mental illness, is the fact that they're putting fluoride in the water. They're poisoning the air we breathe. They're poisoning the food that we eat. They're poisoning the water that we drink. Everything that we're exposed to in our environment is poison. Most of that is excitotoxins. Most of those are brain-damaging, neurological damaging compounds that create you, cause you to be depressed, cause you to have mood swings, cause you to have hyperactivity, artificial dyes, etc., MSG, genetically modified foods, pesticides, herbicides, metals, aluminum, all that gets in the brain, causes a chemical imbalance. Then they give you these psychotropic drugs to try to balance it out, which just makes the problem even worse.
And then they also found some of the key studies in rats and others that the gut is also linked to this in a really, really essential way, to the point where if you're taking a lot of antibiotics and you're not replenishing the body with good gut flora, the beneficial probiotic bacteria that you can take through supplementation or fermented foods and everything like that, then there's a link to your brain where mental illness begins to grow, and they had schizophrenic links to that and everything. So where if the gut is imbalanced, then the brain is imbalanced as well. So you're being attacked on a gut level with the GMOs and everything, just dispersing horrible chemicals that are killing the gut flora. You're taking antibiotics for all the diseases that you have from a weakened immune system and not replenishing them with probiotics. Then you have the excitotoxins and everything. It's total assault on the body. So what is the answer to all of this?
Well, the answer is that people need to take a look back and they need to understand what the real cause is, and then they need to address the cause. They need to switch to organic foods. They need to drink pure water. They need to get rid of all their artificial sweeteners if they're in the diet colas. They need to completely change their lifestyle and not take in any of those excitotoxins and reduce the amount of toxins that they're bringing into their system on a daily basis. And they can do that through cleansing. I mean, there's a lot of good body cleansing programs that are out there right now that will focus on intestinal cleansing, repairing the gut, liver and gallbladder cleansing, parasite cleansing, chemical and heavy metal cleansing. People need to let their body's own self-healing mechanism reactivate. And in order to reactivate your body's self-healing mechanism, you got to get rid of and stay away from all the things that are going to cause the so-called mental illness. Today, children 5 years old and younger are the fastest growing segment of the non-adult population prescribed antidepressants. U.S. children as young as 4 have attempted suicide while influenced by such drugs. Between 1995 and 1999, and that was a long time ago, antidepressant use increased 580% in the under 6 population and 151% in the 7 to 12 age group. So what 0 to 6-year-old do you know that needs an antidepressant? I mean, seriously, how are you going to diagnose a 6-year-old with depression? And not only that, but look at all the things that the antidepressants cause. They cause kidney failure, which leads to people being on dialysis forever. serious weight gain. People get on antidepressants and they gain 30 to 40 pounds usually within the first 3 months. Obesity, okay? Look at that epidemic. Diabetes. So not only are these damaging, but they're also causing more and more other problems that people need to be medicated with. And the thing is, there's no test, documentation, no blood test or anything, x-rays, that can actually prove that anyone has a mental imbalance. So the best thing I can tell everybody to do is, do your research. Look at the dangers of psychotropic drugs out there. If you have children, make sure you watch them and make sure you pay attention to them, because they probably are being influenced by their friends that are on Ritalin and Adderall and these stimulants in school. Know that causes, especially these stimulants, can cause the brain to shrink and can cause permanent brain damage. Don't just trust what your doctor is saying about your kid, or the counselor is saying that your kid needs antidepressants or psychotropic drugs. Look at the natural options that are available out there. Do not get yourself or your children or anybody in your family, if they are on any of these psychotropic drugs, Paxil, Concerta, Prozac, Xanax, any mind-altering drug that's out there, take a strong look at that and see if you can find somebody that can wean you off of that naturally.
It's complete chemical warfare. Dr. Group, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me on.
Ultimately, it is up to us to control our own destiny, to spread the information out there, to reveal that these super hardcore antidepressants, these big pharma pushed pills, do not work. They are killing people. They are leading to the very effects they're supposed to treat. And overall, it's up to us to decide to take control of our health naturally, to inform our friends and family, and to spread the word and decide for ourselves we're going to take the real way of enhancing our health, reclaiming our bodies, and retaking our freedoms from this complete corporate takeover of the medical system.
We've been told time and time again by our state and local health officials, as well as the CDC, NIH, and the FDA, that vaccines are safe and effective. However, studies and science shows otherwise.
The largest, most powerful industry in the world is the pharmaceutical industry. They have fingers into foundations, fingers into major corporations, the media, they are everywhere.
The federal government subsidizes vaccine research and development to the tune of billions of dollars each year. The federal government passed laws removing the vaccine manufacturers from liability from the death and disability caused by their products. State and federal governments mandate vaccines. State and federal governments purchase vaccines. And the federal government compensates those people who manage to successfully get through the vaccine injury compensation program. This is the biggest racket anywhere on the planet. I don't know of any other industry that has this kind of support from government.
And if really these vaccines are so safe and effective as they're being sold as being, then why should they mind if there's no liability protection?
Protection from liability is giving companies no incentive to develop safer products.
One solution would be repeal the 1986 law, right? If the law were repealed, people could sue manufacturers directly. My guess is we'd see a lot safer vaccines.
They're going to consider their bottom line ahead of the safety.
You can't have it both ways. They can't be unavoidably unsafe and safe and effective at the same time. The science, some of the science at the CDC may well have been fraudulent.
Paul Thorson, who was one of the study authors in the 2003 study that's been informally referred to as the Danish study, was hired by the CDC to pull together research to show that vaccines don't cause autism.
What steps has the CDC undertaken to ensure the integrity of the research that was performed by Dr. Thorson, who, as you know, has been indicted for misconduct and misallocation of resources?
Dr. Thorson, who was a co-investigator on a couple of studies that came out on autism, was really just one investigator, and that body of evidence related to vaccines and autism.
All right. Have you gone back to validate the variety of studies he participated in? I mean, you know this guy is a humongous scumbag, one of the most wanted men on earth, and you relied upon him for data to determine whether thimerosal had a negative effect. One of the witnesses told me that the fugitive doctor had been involved in a couple studies with CDC, and I have information here that he was involved in 21 of the 24 studies, and I would like to submit that to the record.
In April of 2011, Paul Thorson was indicted on 13 counts of fraud and 9 counts of money laundering with the CDC, calling into question, as far as I'm concerned, all of his research supposedly showing that vaccines don't cause autism.
As far as we can see, the U.S. government has done almost nothing to bring this man back to justice and to find out what's going on.
Merck, GlaxoSmithKline, they have been forced into settlements, multi-billion-dollar settlements. And guess what? They're repeat offenders.
Vaccine policy and law is being driven by the pharmaceutical industry. We need to understand what that means. This is an industry that routinely engages in criminal behavior. In 2012, Glaxo got a $1 billion criminal fine. In 2009, Pfizer got a $1 billion criminal fine. Criminal and civil fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars in the pharmaceutical industry are common. No one should ever be required to take a product from an industry that routinely engages in criminal behavior.
The U.S. Department of Justice has sued them several times for criminal as well as civil crimes. Now, these are the same manufacturers who have complete immunity when it comes to vaccine injury. So they have no incentive whatsoever to worry about safety because the government has given them a pass.
There are laws in place already and bills for additional laws that would allow children to consent to vaccines. Here in North Carolina, we actually have a law that lets a child of any age consent to vaccines and other medical treatments. This is a blatant violation of the U.S. Constitution. For the pharmaceutical industry, moral, ethical, and even legal boundaries are merely financial considerations. No one goes to jail, there's a net profit, and so they keep engaging in the same criminal behavior.
In 1986, Ronald Reagan signed into law the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, and what it provided for was a compensation program for children who were injured or died as a result of vaccination. So it was absolutely acknowledged that vaccines cause catastrophic injury and death.
I don't like to call it a court because it's not a court. There's not normal rules of civil procedure. There's not a jury. You don't have justice being administered by your peers. It's a special master who's not a scientist, who's not a doctor, it's a lawyer. And that person listens to expert doctors and scientists about whether or not this is plausible, that this was caused by a vaccine. And in something like 4 out of 5 cases, the petitioner doesn't get compensated.
Government participates in the development of vaccines through public-private partnerships, and it also, at the end of the day, is liable for any kind of vaccine injuries.
The result of this 1986 law is you cannot go to court and sue Merck or Sanofi or Glaxo for a defective vaccine or for injuries that you believe were side effects that you were improperly warned, say. Typical tort claims that you can bring against a manufacturer in other medicines, Vioxx, Celebrex. You can't do that for a vaccine. The government stepped into the shoes of the pharmaceutical industry because of this 1986 law.
So this makes it very hard for the government to be an independent and impartial body. And so this is one of the problems, and restoring liability where it belongs with the manufacturer should make vaccines much safer.
Jonas Salk, the inventor of the inactivated polio vaccine, he made this argument to Congress in the hearings for the 1986 statute. He said, I'm very worried that this is going to take away the incentive for manufacturers to make vaccines safer.
In my view, Gardasil would have never happened prior to the 1986 Vaccine Injury Compensation Act.
So this program, although it's very difficult to win, over 3,200 families have prevailed in the injury compensation program, And the federal government has paid out $2.5 billion.
Person who's been permanently disabled with a serious neurologic condition, in a child autism, for example, or in an adult, a brain injury, the cost of care for that person could reach $75,000 or $100,000 a year or more.
So that gives you an idea of how serious these injuries are. That families get awards from very small amounts of $10,000 or $20,000, but up to millions of dollars for life care, for life, because some of these children who are injured are devastated.
Part of the issue, of course, being that nobody is responsible for these kids once they get injured. Then you find out that your son actually does have a vaccine injury and you have no recourse whatsoever. And it is honestly like pulling teeth, trying to get a doctor to even agree that your child may have been affected adversely by vaccines, whether or not you watched it happen.
And if you don't like the decision that the DHHS employee made regarding your claim that you had a vaccine injury, it gets reviewed by another DHHS employee. And if you don't like that, you are barred from entering the court system. There is no way you can litigate your claim.
It's really hard to prove a vaccine injury. I believe that had we been allowing families to go to regular courts with regular juries, with regular rules of discovery and civil procedure over the last 25 years, I believe we wouldn't be seeing the crisis of childhood health that we're seeing today.
So I can't sue them because their creation of that vaccine did this to my kid. I'm financially responsible. They are not. It's just, this is supposed to be America. It's supposed to be free.
2008, a medical doctor from Harvard University, Dr. Marcia Angell, who spent 20 years as an editor for the New England Journal of Medicine, went public and said we can no longer trust the medical authorities and the medical literature. The pressure from money involved with what gets published and what doesn't get published has just skewed the medical publishing industry to the point to where the medical literature is no longer reliable.
I've collected numerous studies. These are just a fraction of studies on lack of safety, lack of efficacy on vaccines. And these are mainstream published peer-reviewed papers. This is just a small stack of them. I've got many more, as do many of my colleagues. Why we are not being heard is for obvious reasons. We're outmoneyed by the industry, by the lobbyists.
The voices of independent scientists who raise issues about vaccine safety are often ignored, or we are personally attacked, and this is not good for science, and this is not good for scientific discourse.
Why are the pharmaceutical companies sponsoring most of the research? Medical research should not be about money, it should be about better medical care and how to improve the life quality of people, not how to make more money.
You can't trust what you hear from the CDC now. You can't trust what you hear from the FDA because those workers have been bought off. They're waiting for their jobs in the pharmaceutical industry. They're waiting for their jobs in the lobbying industry.
In 2010, there were over 330 vaccines either already on the market or in development. In early 2013, there are 250 vaccines either already awaiting approval from the FDA or in clinical trials.
There are hundreds of vaccines in the pipeline for a variety of conditions, including asthma and obesity and smoking, and the list goes on.
We're trading the benefit of that lifelong immunity from normal childhood illnesses for a lifelong suffering of chronic diseases. And that's where we've gone.
1/3 of British nurses have said that they will not take the swine flu vaccine because they're worried about the possible side effects.
Look on the CDC website as to what is in the swine flu vaccine. You know, aluminum, insect repellent, formaldehyde, mercury.
There really is no firm evidence that vaccines do what they say they do.
We have the most unhealthy generation of children in the history of mankind.
Why in our great country, 1 in 3 children has asthma, diabetes, eczema, arthritis, seizures, palsies, peanut anaphylaxis, and other food allergies. autism, ADD, Tourette's syndrome, speech delays, and dozens of other autoimmune, special needs, and neurodevelopmental disorders and delays.
The vaccine known as Gardasil, about 8 million American girls have gotten the vaccine. But is it safe?
But today, Merck's HPV vaccine is dealing with a growing number of reports of serious side effects. Amanda Ratner, she came down with an illness so excruciating she had to take morphine. Her parents, both doctors, blame Gardasil.
She's gone from the position of being a competitive varsity lacrosse player in high school to somebody who's chronically ill.
14-year-old Jenny developed life-threatening paralysis that's resistant to treatment. Merck and the CDC say Gardasil is safe and effective, and that they've not found a link to any deaths. They also say illnesses reported after vaccinations may not have been caused by the shot.
It's kind of an unrefined method that they use. They had to use these high levels of these adjuncts, including
thimerosal. It's an antiseptic preservative, and hasn't that been linked in some cases to autism?
It has, and you look, it's been shown to cause autism in children with mitochondrial dysfunction.
Even if you were to hypothesize that there is a vaccine that could be necessary, that could maybe save a life that would have otherwise died from an infectious disease, there is always a cost.
In the 1980s, the autism rate in the country was 1 in 10,000. It's now 1 in 50.
Looking at the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, what I found that the CDC and the FDA were telling people and the truth of the vaccines were two different things.
It's really hard to try to find unbiased research that doesn't somehow have the drug companies associated with it. What we do to these newborns is within minutes of birth, they're exposed to latex, they're exposed to vitamin K shots. Within a few more hours after birth, then we give them a hepatitis B vaccine. So a mere 8 weeks old, 56 days of life on this planet, the baby goes in for its first well baby checkup. And at that time, they may be given up to 6 or 7 different vaccines. A DPT, which is diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, a polio vaccine, another hepatitis B vaccine, a Hib, which is for Haemophilus influenza B, and possibly a Prevnar vaccine, which is 7 strains of strep, maybe even 13 strains of strep, all given at the same time. So it's like giving 20 or 30 vaccine antigens in about 5 or 6 shots. That process is repeated at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months. They get another big dose of vaccines at 1 year of age, so that by the time children are 1 year old, they will have had more than 70 different vaccine antigens injected and measurable amounts of chemicals. In fact, the 2 vaccines that have the highest amount of chemicals, in my opinion, are the MMR and the chickenpox vaccine. Each of those shots have chemicals, things like aluminum, polysorbate 80, all kinds of toxic chemicals that are causing lots of problems in immune systems.
Beyond any shadow of a doubt, aluminum adjuvants on their own can inflict autoimmune diseases.
They go in for their 1 year checkup with their pediatrician, and they get another round of vaccines, and many of them, within hours, days, weeks, or months, digress into autism.
There's no such thing as a harmless vaccine.
Autism is, in my opinion, at the far end of what's happening in terms of brain destruction from these vaccines.
The idea that we can put toxins and poisons into a perfectly healthy immune system is naive at best, and it's probably quite evil. We know that autism, for example, is skyrocketing. And it's not anymore a question or a debate that, oh, we're just diagnosing the condition better. There is a true increase in the rates of autism, and people are looking for answers. We now know that immune molecules play crucial roles in brain development. This means that you cannot manipulate the immune system and think that that will not have adverse outcome, especially if you manipulate the immune system in early development. Some people have pointed that vaccines could be the problem, but they're often ridiculed for such assertions. But there is actually a scientific rationale for that, not just a scientific rationale, but there's also scientific data.
By the time the average child in this country has started kindergarten, they've gotten 49 doses to 14 different vaccines. over 50% of our children now have some kind of chronic illness, over 50%.
I would ask those who say that children can receive 10,000 immunization for very safely, I would simply ask them, well, can you demonstrate that by injecting yourself with 10,000 vaccines, and then you can give us your brain for analysis and see what we find after.
When I hear statements such as Paul Offit saying that a baby can receive up to 10,000 to 100,000 vaccines at one go, it's difficult to even describe. The emotions that come up for me, I think, are rage, that this man has the kind of platform he does and has the kind of media attention. I mean, he's the main media mouthpiece for the medical establishment speaking about vaccines. He and his attitude are an absolutely catastrophic danger to infant and young child health.
To give a combination vaccine and then to load in, for example, other vaccines containing mercury preservatives and aluminum, which are going to alter the immune response even more profoundly, then no, we certainly do not, nor could anyone claim to know that those vaccines are safe. They are not, and there is a fundamental rule that something is unsafe until proven otherwise.
You know, the rationale, the reasoning for how some of these drug companies and how the FDA concludes that something is safe or not safe is not based in rational science. It's based in, a pre-biased setup, really. We want to be able to use this substance. It's a cheap way of preserving it, or it's a cheap way of reaching the blood-brain barrier to produce a larger immune response. We want to be able to use this product. Let's look for a study or do a study that we can say we've done it. What gets done is a bogus study or no study, but in some cases I was sent, when I requested information from one of the drug companies, a study on one of the ingredients, and it literally was a cosmetic study for topical application, but yet it was something that was being injected.
Vaccines contain formaldehyde, and they contain chemicals far in excess concentrations of what the EPA says is safe. Mercury in the past was used as a preservative. The reason it works as a preservative is because it's so cellular toxic. Because if you put mercury in a culture of cells, they will just die. Things don't live in the presence of mercury.
We're now telling our senior citizens to take flu vaccine. And guess what's in flu vaccine? Mercury. Mercury, every year, a senior citizen gets their flu jab. Every year, a bit more toxin is accumulating in their brain. And what are we now getting? An epidemic of dementia. This is our granddads and our grandmothers. These are the people we're now poisoning with our vaccines.
My name is Dr. Janet Levitin, and I come to speak to you today as a clinician. I've been a pediatrician since 1982. When I was in my residency, I saw a baby die of sudden infant death just within hours after having been vaccinated. This is an event I saw take place 2 more times in my early medical career.
Since 1989, there are records of 42 children from Massachusetts that have died around their vaccinations. 98% of them were trying to receive a school-required vaccination. Nearly 90% died within the first 10 days, a third dying within the first 24 hours. This is Ryan, hours after his MMR, the last day that he was a neurotypical child.
15 months, we got his MMR. I remember him not sleeping that night, crying and waking up with a very toxic smelling diaper. I also remember 48 hours later he had a 105-degree temperature. 3 days after that he had a full body rash. He started staring episodes, which we later realized were absent seizures. At 18 months we discussed some of the changes, but his gross motor skills were still really good, so we gave him his 18-month shots. The next day he stopped calling me mommy, he stopped wanting to be in the same room with his father, and he stopped following his sister around. By 2, everything was gone.
He was born full term, normal in every way, vaginal birth with no interventions or drugs. His APGAR scores were 9 and 10, which means all his reflexes were perfect and present. Before discharge, he was immunized with Recombavax HB against hepatitis B. His 4th night in this world was his first at home, and about 5 hours after arriving home, he had his first seizure. The doctors told us we were causing Ben's seizures, odd behaviors, and delays by bad parenting.
My son came out and he appeared to be normal at birth. And then when they took him back to the nursery, he was given the hepatitis B shot, which contains mercury, and something happened to him in his blood where he became very ill and they put him in ICU. My son could yell or scream for 45 minutes straight and not stop. There was times he would crawl out of his car seat. I'd have to pull over on the side of the road and he would be doing flips on my body, just screaming, just rages that you would not believe. I would have people stopping and writing my license number down.
The language was lost. He drooled incessantly. He had extremely low muscle tone. Diarrhea was our first major red flag. Regressive autism is that your child does develop typically, and he does look like this true, perfect little thing. And then all of a sudden you wake up and they're gone.
I'm crying my eyes out to the doctor saying, I know these things started this with my child. The vaccines caused this in my child. I could look at the videos and see the change in my child. I don't want her vaccinated. He said I had to. As more vaccinations came, more regression came. After the MMR, within a month of that, she started to bang her head against the wall. She started to just run right into the wall, and it didn't seem as if she had any type of pain or feeling.
Lindsay is representative of all the children who fall under the mandate. Lindsay received the hepatitis B vaccine 2 days before entering high school. The next day, she seemed flu-like. The day after that, so dizzy, she couldn't stand up without holding the walls. The following day, she passed out. Her ability to stand was compromised for almost 6 months due to unremitting dizziness. Following our doctor's advice, Lindsay had the series of 3. It was on the 3rd shot Lindsay became so violently ill within 2 hours that I knew the vaccine was the catalyst of her illness.
And my daughter received the vaccine. About 3 weeks later, noticed a little bit of discomfort in her arm. Gradually, over the next few weeks, it got worse and worse. At that point, she was anemic. To be put in the hospital, had a bone marrow biopsy. There was concern that she had leukemia, had a muscle biopsy because of the affected area of her arm. The following summer, she had meningitis as a consequence of her illness. She had a neurologic problem, which was recognized to be part of this illness that required another spinal tap and MRIs and more medication. And it was all localized at the beginning in the arm where she had the Gardasil vaccine. You know, it would take a lot for somebody to come up to me, you know, as a professional and say, you know, I think your daughter is making these symptoms up. She had objective evidence, you know, abnormal spinal taps, clinical events, blood tests that were abnormal. Nobody could look at that and say, this is something, you know, your daughter's making up. This is a coincidence. You know, your daughter has some bizarre illness which doesn't have a name, which we never heard of and can't identify or quantify in any way. But, you know, we know that it's not related to the vaccine. Several have come out and say, well, yes, of course, this is obviously related to something in the vaccine.
I couldn't believe that they would put children's lives at risk. And now I feel like I was taken advantage of, and that I was naive, and as was Chris, her life was taken from a vaccine she didn't need, about which we were falsely informed, for a disease she never would have gotten.
Governor Rick Perry, a Republican, who made Texas the first state to mandate that 6th grade girls receive the HPV vaccine.
In the midst of this executive order, there was a big drug company that made millions of dollars because of this mandate. The governor's former chief of staff was the chief lobbyist for this drug company. The drug company gave thousands of dollars in political donations to the governor, and this is just flat out wrong. The question is it about life, or was it about millions of dollars and potentially billions for a drug company?
All right. This is not a vaccine against a pandemic. It's not a vaccine against a childhood illness that will kill you. It is a vaccine against a virus that 90% of the time does absolutely nothing to anybody.
So we were recently approached by two mothers whose daughters have died approximately 6 months following vaccinations with the HPV vaccines. Both girls showed similar symptoms, mainly affecting the nervous system, periods of amnesia, difficulties in speech, periods of confusion, psychosis. The symptoms started after the first shot. One girl died after the second dose of Gardasil, and another girl died after the third dose of Gardasil.
I find it to be shameful what's going on with the treatment of some of these kids, as well as the denial of the vaccine community that there may be an issue. The very existence of the possibility of any type of illness related to vaccines is summarily denied by the pro-vaccine activists, and it simply is not a reasonable, scientifically based dismissal. No one knows if there are going to be long-term sequelae from vaccinating these girls, if it's going to affect fertility, affect cancer rates, affect other hormonal issues or their immune system in the long run. There's nothing to say that it will, there's nothing to say that it won't.
So if the recommendation is boosters throughout the life, but if you've already been exposed and you receive the vaccine, it could potentiate the virus, then we're dealing with a vaccine that's probably going to be causing a whole lot more cervical cancers than it ever saves.
Subjecting millions and millions of women to eliminate a few thousand cases of cancer doesn't really seem justified to me, even if it does eliminate those cancers. Even if it is effective, I wouldn't do it. I've weighed the evidence, and I would urge that other people do the same. There simply isn't any data that it prevents cancer in women. And there's no reason that one should mandate it for your own child as a cancer preventative.
Gardasil does not treat cervical cancer or other HPV diseases.
Side effects include pain, swelling, itching and redness at the injection site, fever, nausea, dizziness, vomiting, and fainting.
Gardasil is not for women who are pregnant.
Gardasil may not fully protect everyone and does not prevent all kinds of cervical cancer.
Death rates, especially pediatric death rates, but death rates in general from infectious diseases began to climb again. And even if you take HIV out of the equation, there are more people now dying from infectious diseases than there were in 1970.
And I'm convinced that the mercury in vaccinations is a contributing factor to neurological diseases such as autism and Alzheimer's. I'm convinced of it after all those years we had hearings. But that word, conclusive, there's no conclusive evidence, creates a doubt. And my question to the presidents and CEOs of pharmaceutical companies has always been, if there's any doubt that the mercury in vaccinations can cause a neurological problem, then get it out.
It's not just the mercury. Yes, the mercury is a problem, but it's not just the mercury. And the pharmaceutical industry has pretty much proven that by taking most of the mercury out. Yes, it is still in the flu shots, the multi-dose flu shots. It was in the H1N1 swine flu vaccine. We still have traces of it in other vaccines, but for the most part, the lion's share of the mercury is out. And we're still having an increased incidence of autism and chronic disease. So that was pretty easy for the pharmaceutical industry to just go, see, told you, won the mercury. Because it never was just the mercury. It's all the aluminum, it's polysorbate 80, it's a long list of 62 different types of chemicals that are in these vaccines and different combinations of them. It's the latex exposure, it's the gelatin exposure, it's the whole combination of the number of vaccines that children get now. It never was just about the mercury.
The aluminum is used to do a different job. The aluminum is used to basically cause an intense inflammatory reaction at the injection site so that perhaps less disease matter is needed in the vaccine.
Aluminum is a known neurotoxin, and it is often claimed by the regulatory authorities that the amounts of aluminum in vaccines is insignificant and that you get more aluminum from food than you get from injection. Well, this kind of reasoning really defies basic toxicological principles. These claims are misleading because we know from research data that only 0.25% of aluminum that we ingest is absorbed into circulation, whereas the aluminum we inject via vaccination is absorbed with 100%. The medical authorities will also say that you can easily excrete aluminum in vaccines, but that claim makes no sense whatsoever, because aluminum would be a very lousy adjuvant if it was excreted. The whole premise of an adjuvant is that it stays in your body and it boosts the immune response. And we have now data, human data, that shows that humans retain aluminum from vaccinations up to 8 years following injections. Aluminum in vaccines is attached to an antigen, so it doesn't get readily excreted because it simply doesn't pass through the kidneys. And in fact, research in animal models shows that it's retained. And not only is it retained in the body, but part of the adjuvant aluminum is transported by the macrophages in the brain of animals. And once in the brain, it triggers abnormal autoimmune inflammatory reactions.
Many people, even if they talk about the dangers of vaccines, will mention, they'll preface, oh, but, vaccines have saved us from all these diseases that were killing us. And I actually believed that for a long time. And I didn't start to question that until I started, looking at some of these graphs. In the 1900s, people died of scurvy. People died of tuberculosis. People died of yellow fever in this country. They died of scarlet fever. We never vaccinated away tuberculosis, yellow fever, scarlet fever. I use those as examples. People aren't dying of them in this country, right? And we didn't vaccinate away against it.
They say that the introduction of vaccines actually reduced the amount of infectious diseases. But if you go back to the beginning of the century, you will really see that the thing that was reducing infectious diseases was an improvement in diet, an improvement in sanitation, an improvement in education, the environmental things that were improving as a result of improving economies. The number of infectious diseases were going down. Many of the infectious diseases were already 90% reduced when the vaccines were introduced.
We know from historical documents that come either from history or from government bodies like the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, that have tracked these illnesses. And illnesses have spiked and been mostly gone by the time a vaccine was introduced, making the vaccine the hero when in fact the illness was mostly gone before the vaccine ever came on the horizon.
Animal models were injected with vaccines that created antibodies, and then they were introduced with the virus and still succumb to the virus. So we don't have real studies that say if you have an antibody to this disease, you are then immune and you are immune for this many years. We don't have that.
Where's the evidence for the claim that vaccines, whether singly or in combination, as children get them very often, are in fact safe and effective? There is no definitive answer to that.
When I first started researching vaccination and looking at the whole concept of vaccine efficacy, because what always comes out is that vaccines are safe and effective, it took me a while to figure out what that word effective really even meant. We as clinicians and doctors and even parents in the lay public, when they hear the word effective, they assume that what that means when the phrase is said, vaccines are safe and effective, meaning that vaccines are safe and they will keep you from getting sick.
To determine whether or not a vaccine is effective, you would basically have to do exposure experiments to people or to animals if you were going to show that it was effective or not. You'd have to give the vaccine, and then you would have to see if you exposed the animal to the pathogen, that would you be causing disease or not, and would there be a difference in the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated population? Well, it's considered unethical to do that with human beings, to expose them to, anthrax or a polio virus or a flu virus. So in general, the way vaccines are determined to be effective are if there's an antibody titer generated. And if that antibody is generated, it's considered to be effective.
Do the antibodies really mean that you are chronically sick? Does it mean you've had an exposure? You've had a certain level of protective antibody and you can still get sick? So the whole word in the scientific literature about effective vaccines means that you create an antibody, but that doesn't necessarily translate from effective into protecting you from getting sick.
And oftentimes there isn't even that antibody generated in many of the people who are injected with vaccines. Elderly people, immunocompromised people often won't even generate that antibody, so it's often a complete waste in them. So that's how effectiveness is determined by the companies when developing new vaccines.
There is this prevalent belief in the medical community that if you vaccinate 90% or 95% of individuals, you will effectively prevent the spread of infectious diseases. And the term that is used is herd immunity. So basically, you immunize almost the entire population, you will eliminate the spread of an infectious agent. Now, that theory sounds really good, but it's only a theory. It hasn't actually been demonstrated. And if you look at the real-world data, you see that their outbreaks frequently occur even if there is 90% of population that has been vaccinated. So this whole concept of herd immunity is simply doesn't hold water, because if it were true, you should not see any cases of infectious diseases outbreaks in populations that have been vaccinated.
There are problems that come up with prolonged mass vaccination campaigns. And one of them is that between the time that the vaccine is introduced on a massive scale and a few decades later, the disease actually becomes more dangerous.
Clinical trials testing not only safety of individual vaccines, but safety of vaccines given together, the kind of spacing components, how frequently they have to be given. And
we don't have these studies. And the only study that I could find that came close was a primate study where and I believe it was macaques, that they used macaques and they adjusted the dose for the weight appropriate for the macaque. And these monkeys did not do well, in fact, that they showed signs of regression and autism and behavior changes and developmental delay and abnormal behaviors and poor rooting and poor sucking in the infant ones. So, in fact, the only study that I've read about, that I've seen when I've done my search, has been on monkeys, has been on primates, and it was not favorable towards our schedule.
To make a vaccine is essentially a manipulation of nature that can only possibly end in disaster. Because what you have to do is you have to go out and find a pathogen, bring it into the lab, and then you have to multiply that pathogen and adjust it to be in the form that you want it to be in, to ultimately be injected into an infant or a toddler or an adult.
We should consider the benefits and the risks of vaccination. Unfortunately, our public health officials haven't got to that point, and they keep repeating that the benefits of vaccinations outweigh the risk, but we don't really have the studies to prove that.
Now, vaccines, for the most part, children's vaccines, are mandatory. That's real extremism.
One of our basic human rights is that we should have control of what goes into our bodies, and mandates are violating this basic human right.
And the only way that vaccines work as they do right now is because they're mandated, right? Kids can't go to school unless they comply.
The vast majority of hospitals around the country are implementing exemption policies for vaccines for their employees that violate federal law. And this really concerns me. They're overly aggressive in requiring vaccines and not allowing people to refuse vaccines, in many cases, who have a valid legal right to refuse the vaccines.
We have the emergency community, the Homeland Security, Federal Emergency Management Agency people talking about forced vaccinations, forced quarantines, basically the politicians running the show instead of the people who are from the medical community.
I've talked with healthcare workers from all over the country, and they report to me, they see the vaccine damage firsthand. They see their coworkers, and in many cases, the healthcare workers that call me themselves report vaccine injuries. And this is why we see more and more healthcare workers objecting to mandatory vaccines in the workplace.
There are new laws that have been passed which even require a registry of children who are not vaccinated, their parents. This is getting close to a kind of a Stalinist regime.
If the current aggressive agenda for vaccines continues playing out, and this amounts to more and more people being required to get more and more vaccines with no end in sight, we are moving in the direction of what I can only call a vaccine police state.
In a democracy where citizens are expected to be able to make choices for themselves, the government is instead telling people what to do, requiring people what to do. And that itself makes a lot of people unhappy, especially when there are hazards involved.
The pharmaceutical industry and the government promotes vaccines by telling the public these are safe and effective. That's what they say. And yet, legally speaking, they're unavoidably unsafe.
It's an established medical and legal fact that vaccines cause permanent disability and death. Officials from the FDA, CDC, and the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons have all said that something on the order of 90 to 99% of vaccine adverse events are never even reported. So we really have no idea, no hard data to tell us what the scope of vaccine injury and death is. Therefore, it's impossible to make a calculation about whether or not there's a net benefit from vaccines.
So there's a real contradiction here at the core of vaccine policy and law. But if they're really as safe and effective as they tell us they are, then surely everyone will opt for them. Surely a market would handle this.
Going back 3 centuries, there have been a huge variety of conflicts over all kinds of vaccines where people have rioted, people have fought in their legislatures, often successfully, to contest vaccines and their mandating.
Mandatory why? Well, the story is that if 95% of the population isn't vaccinated, there won't be so-called herd immunity. You can't have 95% of the population immune if the children's vaccines only give you immunity for 2 to 10 years. That means that most adults, in fact, are not immune. Well, but it's a very potent weapon. It's a justification for mandating vaccines, because if everyone who is vaccinated but who may have a neighboring child who's not vaccinated, they might be at risk. This is the way the argument goes. But it does have power to persuade states to force vaccines on children.
I'm hearing from people around the country saying that pediatricians are just flat out refusing to treat any child who's not vaccinated, whether parents have a legal exemption or not. And in many cases, I believe this is actually violating parents' constitutional rights.
Public health monies from the federal government can be dependent on state compliance rates. So for instance, in New York City public schools, we've found letters on the internet from the health department to principals that state if your school doesn't have a compliance rate of 98%, i.e., your vaccine compliance rate, you personally, the principal personally can be fined, because the school district, the health department will get less money from the federal government.
Well, Obamacare has language that provides grants to states for promoting vaccines that includes things such as having people go door to door.
Is on independent study.
Yeah.
Kayla, has she been verified with her Tdap?
No.
Okay. We were coming today to give her a Tdap if she hasn't had it done yet.
Get the off my house.
I don't know what the end game is here. The direction we're moving is a very disturbing direction where we're seeing more and more vaccines required and our rights to make informed choices being taken away.
We don't have an intelligent media to at least demand answers of those in authority.
Within my news department at WBZ, I began to present the scientific research that was current and recent and new to news management. I also began to present them stories of vaccine-damaged children that I had come across in my scientific investigations. What I was told time and time again is that there is no story, that the science is settled, that there's no reason to present stories of this nature on TV because simply these are fringe stories. This is not representing the masses. And to me, it was surprising because I thought the media was supposed to be a voice of the people, and clearly at that point in my newsroom, it was not acting as a voice of the people.
You know, it's been said that a lie repeated often enough will become the truth. I like to think that the truth repeated often enough can do the same thing.
We need to be able to give our parents enough information to make informed choices. And I think that we need to actually stop with the vaccines at this point.
But it's a problem if the government is going to pass laws that are going to coerce and are going to have vaccine squads looking for children who haven't been vaccinated. Well, then we're in very, very big danger.
Just say no, right? Until your kid has to go to daycare or until your kid has to go to school, 48 states out of 50, there are religious exemptions. If as a matter of religious sentiment and consciousness, you cannot vaccinate your child, you have the right to file a religious exemption. And people are now doing that in higher numbers than they used to. In 19 states, there are philosophical exemptions. People can say, no, I'm not going to give the hepatitis B vaccine. I don't believe in that. I believe in polio. I don't believe in hepatitis B. And that's fine.
I think every parent has the right responsibility and should have the authority to make health choices about their children.
We need to ask people to look at this. You know, this is a serious medical intervention. Is it justified?
So I encourage the committee to endorse this bill and the legislature to pass the bill that will allow people to decline on vaccines or delay vaccines, not only due to their religious beliefs, but because of perhaps their ethical beliefs, their moral beliefs, their lifestyle, their philosophy, their conscience.
It's a fundamental human right to control your own health in that regard.
Does the science support this? Is there science to show this is safe for a day-old infant? The federal recommendation is that day-old infants get a vaccine against a sexually transmitted disease, hepatitis B.
It is a vast and uncontrolled human experiment.
So there are very serious questions. And is it possible that there could be lawsuits for fraud and for malfeasance? For overreaching by state authorities, yes, I think there are possibilities, and I'm very interested in pursuing them.
Time is ticking, and our next generations are becoming more and more injured. The rates of autism and chronic diseases are skyrocketing out of control in the next generation.
Most of the epidemiology out there will not ever pick up the subset of children that will react to these vaccines.
Each of the individuals that get vaccinated, they have responses each time they're vaccinated, and those are cumulative, but vaccine safety does not require cumulative testing, and even the testing for single vaccines is very limited.
And all we are asking you to do as parents, as citizens, as representatives of injured children, is to allow parents to make a choice about medical procedures that are performed on their children in order that they may participate in the most fundamental right of citizenship, which is the school system.
No American should be legally forced to play vaccine roulette with their child.
We have sacrificed an entire generation of children's brains and health to build a pharmaceutical industry.
You can't have it both ways. They can't be unavoidably unsafe and safe and effective at the same time.
The fact that vaccines must be mandated is a sign of the failure of their program.
We're playing with fire. We've got a lot of viral material we're playing with, DNA we're playing with, foreign DNA from animals, from green monkeys, from chicken eggs, all kinds of DNA that we're not eating, we're injecting. What are we creating? We don't even know. It's like Frankenstein.
Do we really believe that health can only come through a vaccine?
there's just no basis for saying they're safe. There's zero basis.
Fluoride. Dentists say that drinking it can protect your teeth against cavities. Cities and towns all across the world actually dump it into the water supply, hoping to indiscriminately medicate the population through their tap water faucets. The official story on fluoride sounds wonderful. Drink the stuff and you won't get cavities, we're told. It's a nice story. But there's another side to this story, the side you're never told. And it starts with the astonishing but verifiable fact that nearly all the fluoride dripped into municipal water supplies isn't naturally occurring fluoride at all. In fact, it's actually a combination of hexafluorosilicic acid and sodium silicofluoride. These two chemicals are considered highly toxic by the EPA. They're actually classified as hazardous waste, and when packaged for transportation, they must be labeled as poison and handled by workers wearing industrial safety gear. So, what are hexafluorosilicic acid and sodium silicofluoride, and where do they come from? That's the part of this story that you probably won't believe. That is, not until you check it out for yourself. Because the more you look into the mythology of fluoride, the more bizarre this story becomes. And this bizarre story begins at phosphate mining companies. Phosphate is an important mineral used in fertilizers. It's mined from natural rock deposits scattered across the world, and the phosphate rock is then refined to produce phosphoric acid. If that name sounds familiar, that's because it's one of the main ingredients in carbonated sodas, such as Coke and Pepsi. Phosphoric acid is often compared to battery acid. It's a highly acidic liquid that is believed to be the primary reason why drinking sodas can result in kidney stones and a loss of bone mineral density. Phosphate rock is also used to create fertilizers. The problem is phosphate is often contaminated with high levels of fluoride, as much as 40,000 parts per million, or up to 4% of the raw ore. To remove the fluoride, sulfuric acid is added to a wet slurry of phosphate and water. This causes the fluoride to vaporize, creating highly toxic gaseous compounds such as hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride. These toxic fluoride chemicals used to be released directly from the smokestacks of phosphate mining operations, but the nearby farms suffered devastating losses of cattle and food crops, which withered away and died due to, guess what? Fluoride poisoning. In order to stop this environmental destruction, the phosphate mining industry put in place a way to capture the toxic fluoride chemical vapors so that they wouldn't be released into the air and kill the surrounding livestock and vegetation. This was accomplished by installing wet scrubbers that captured the toxic fluoride chemicals, preventing them from being released into the environment and killing the plant and animal life living nearby. It is from these wet scrubbers that toxic fluoride chemicals are now harvested. They're collected, repackaged, shipped to your local city, and then dumped into the municipal water supply. So instead of these toxic fluoride chemicals being released by the phosphate mining smokestacks, they are instead captured and then released into the water supply of large cities, where the chemicals then contaminate the water of millions of people at a time. This is called water fluoridation. When dentists and doctors say they support fluoride in the water supply, what they're really saying is that they support the mass poisoning of the population with a highly toxic hazardous waste product that, if it weren't dripped into the water supply, it would have to be disposed of as a highly toxic hazardous waste under strict EPA regulations. Curiously, it is a violation of federal law to dump hexafluorosilicic acid or sodium silicofluoride into the water. Such an act, in fact, is considered an act of terrorism. Yet it is mysteriously allowed today as long as it is accompanied by a loosely justified claim that we're doing this to stop cavities. But setting aside for the moment the inconvenient truth that water fluoridation involves the illegal act of dumping hazardous waste into the water supply, there's another important question in all this. Do these toxic fluoride chemicals actually prevent cavities? Roughly 99% of the municipal water pumped through any given city never ends up in the mouths of the people. Most water is used for showering, washing dishes, washing clothes, watering yards, and filling pools. Almost none of the fluoride dripped into the water supply comes into contact with human teeth. It does, however, end up downstream, where it contaminates rivers, streams, and ultimately the oceans of our world. In this way, water fluoridation policies have become a convenient loophole through which the phosphate mining industry can dump its toxic waste byproducts into the environment without adhering to any EPA regulations whatsoever. Phosphate mining companies even turn a profit by selling their hazardous waste to cities, then labeling it fluoride, even though this name is scientifically inaccurate. All this raises an obvious question. If fluoride kills cows and crops and fish and is considered a hazardous waste chemical by the EPA, then how could it be healthy to ingest? And why don't doctors and dentists, even though they openly recommend fluoride, sometimes with irrational exuberance, know where fluoride really comes from? If dentists knew fluoride was derived from the chemical waste of the phosphate mining industry, would they still recommend that we consume it? The truth about fluoride is a lot like the truth about Enron or Goldman Sachs, or every other shocking revelation that nobody believed until it suddenly became obvious that we were all being fooled for so long. Fluoride is a clever scheme where a hazardous waste chemical is dumped into the environment by passing it through the bodies of people first. We, the people, have become the toxic waste dump site of the phosphate mining industry, and chances are your local dentist fully supports this entire process. Over the last several decades, an astonishing 24 studies have established a statistical link between fluoride exposure and low IQs in children. One study conducted by the Center for Endemic Disease Control in China found that each additional milligram of fluoride detected in every liter of a child's urine was associated with a 0.59 point decrease in their IQ score. Another study found that fluoride exposure slashed the number of children achieving high IQs by more than 70%. It shouldn't be surprising, of course, to learn that consuming a hazardous chemical might impair brain function. Water fluoridation, it turns out, may be the root cause of the alarming drop in academic aptitude among children in first world nations. Historically speaking, the mathematics that were taught to 8th graders in the 1950s are now college-level courses in 2011. Don't drink unfiltered tap water. In addition to the toxic fluoride chemicals, tap water is also usually contaminated with chlorine and even dangerous elements from old water pipes.
Genetic engineering is a process where scientists take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species.
Every single independent study conducted on the impact of genetically modified food shows that it damages organs, it causes infertility, it causes immune system failure, it causes holes in the GI tract, it causes multiple organ system failure.
The whole concept of genetically modified organisms is throwing a monkey wrench in the life on this planet.
What if we could produce more yield on the same amount of land, squeeze more water from a single raindrop, conserve natural resources while caring for the environment?
Monsanto is the company that told us that PCBs were safe. They told us that Agent Orange was safe. They told us that DDT was safe, and now they're in charge of telling us if their own genetically modified foods are safe. If you have an organic corn crop that sits next to a genetically engineered corn field, and it happens to tassel at the same time, and it happens to be downwind, you're going to get your crop contaminated.
The rest of the food supply is contaminated. Then the genie is out of the bottle, and it's maybe physically impossible to turn the situation around.
In the genetic engineering revolution, these seeds are now patented property of one corporation called Monsanto.
The pharmaceutical industry has no interest in having you well because they don't make any money if you're well. And the pharmaceutical industry is the biotech industry.
Some people think that GMO really means God move over.
We are heading downhill at a rapid rate of speed toward our own extinction.
The use of GM in agriculture is a risk that is simply not worth taking.
Any scientist that looks into the research or the lack of research on the safety of genetically engineered food comes to the conclusion that these foods should not be on the market. They need another decade or two of research.
Monsanto is the company that told us that PCBs were safe. They were convicted of actually poisoning people in their town next to the PCB factory and fined $700 million. They told us that Agent Orange was safe. They told us that DDT was safe, and now they're in charge of telling us if their own genetically modified foods are safe. Because the FDA doesn't require a single safety study, they leave it to Monsanto. Why did the FDA abdicate their responsibility to protect us? The White House had instructed the FDA to promote biotechnology under the first Bush administration. And so the FDA created a new position for Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney. So Michael Taylor was in charge of policy at the FDA when this GMO policy was created, and then he became Monsanto's vice president, and under the Obama administration was put back in the FDA as the U.S. food safety czar. In reality, the overwhelming consensus among the scientists at the FDA were not only that GMOs were different, but that they were inherently dangerous, that they might create allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. They had urged their superiors to require long-term study, and when they saw drafts of the policy coming back to them, they were angry and urged their political appointees to change course. But Michael Taylor and the political appointees ignored the science, ignored the scientists, denied the existence of their concerns, and set forth a policy that allowed GMOs to be put on the market in a way that creates unprecedented risk for human beings and the environment.
The FDA is composed of smart people, but they're smart people with a conflict of interest. They're smart people who make their decisions based on what will support their financial needs or their academic needs, not what makes scientific sense.
Most people don't realize that Monsanto has been around for about a century. They've acquired lots of resources, and they are very clever and sophisticated. They know how the game works. They understand lobbying. They understand bribery. They have been effective at essentially stacking the political structure, the federal regulatory agencies in their favor, to the point that it's almost physically impossible to pass any type of federal regulations or legislation because the people who make those choices have been in the revolving door of Monsanto. They either previously worked for them or they're paid consultants for them.
Not a single human being on earth gets up and says, boy, I can't wait to go to the supermarket and buy a GMO food. And why is that? That's because after 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars of public and private investment, they haven't been able to come up with one thing in this food that actually helps the consumer. No better taste, no lower price, no more nutrition, nothing. Zip, zero, nada. 85% of all the genetically engineered crops in this country and around the world are designed so you can soak them with weed killers, toxic herbicides. And who are the big companies that do this? Come on, you know who they are. Monsanto, anybody, what? Who else? DuPont, Dow Chemical, Syngenta, Bayer. What kind of companies are these? Chemical companies.
As the chemical seed package has spread, and now with genetically engineered seed that originally was free in India because it belonged to the farmers, or was low cost because it was released from the public sector universities that did seed breeding. In the genetic engineering revolution, these seeds are now patented property of one corporation called Monsanto.
They take genetic material, either DNA or RNA, and insert it using very sophisticated techniques and create an artificial life form, a transgenic species that is impossible to reproduce in nature because the reproductive organs don't match. And as a result, once this form is created, here's the danger. It can cross-pollinate, it can contaminate the traditional crops.
Percy Schmeiser was a farmer in Canada who was contaminated by Monsanto's genetically modified seed. Well, he realized he'd been contaminated because he used some of this herbicide to kill off weeds around utility poles on his property. When he saw some of the seed did not die from the application of glyphosate, he knew it must be genetically modified. Well, he didn't do anything to purge his property of that contaminated seed. It would actually take 3 years of taking your crops out of use before you could completely purge them of the genetically modified seed. He decided he didn't want to do that because that would be costly. So he saved his seed for planting the following year, and Monsanto said, well, you now knew that you had genetically modified seed. You saved it for planting a second year. That's infringement. They sued him for patent infringement. It went all the way up to the Canadian Supreme Court, and although they found that technically he did infringe their patent, they awarded Monsanto no damages.
Both in Canada and the United States, hundreds of farmers have been totally bankrupt, lost their farms and so on through lawsuits by Monsanto. So there's a real fear. Now we call it the new fear, a fear culture amongst farmers, where a corporation now, through the rights of patents on a gene, have which is inserted into a seed to make it resistant to a chemical or whatever, is that they lose their rights to use their own seeds or plants. So it's total control eventually that farmers have to go back to a corporation like Monsanto each year to buy their seed because they're no longer allowed to use their own seeds. So as a victim, you basically have to pay for your lawsuit, your damages, and so on. So farmers become victims and they have done nothing wrong because they were contaminated by a neighbor, by whatever means, by pollen flow, by seeds blown in the wind, transportation, and so on. So it doesn't matter how it happens. If you are contaminated, it's over and it's over.
In the mid-90s, the UK government gave about $3 million to a scientist to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. That scientist was Dr. Arpad Pusztai, the world's leading expert in his field. He worked at the top nutritional research laboratory in the UK, one of the best in the world. He had about 20 or 30 researchers working with him in 3 different institutes, and his protocols that he was designing were supposed to be implemented into EU law as requirements for the safety assessments of any GMOs to be introduced into Europe. He took a potato that was genetically engineered to produce an insecticide and fed one group of rats the genetically engineered potato. He fed another group of rats natural potatoes, and a third group of rats natural potatoes, plus their meal was spiked with the same insecticide that the GM potato was engineered to produce. So you have GM potato, natural potato, and natural potato plus an insecticide, and all 3 had a complete and balanced diet as well.
We measured all sorts of things, growth, for example, how these young animals were growing, what happened to their inside and what happened to their immune system. And it became clear that the GM had a slower growth. It had problems with internal development of its organs, and it certainly knocked out the immune system.
Only the rats that ate the GM potato got sick. They had potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system in 10 days. What was the cause of that damage? It was not the insecticide, because the group eating the insecticide did not have the problem. It was understood that it was the process of genetic engineering itself and the unpredicted side effects that caused this profound damage to every system and organ studied. Now, what do the livestock in the United States eat? They eat largely Roundup-ready crops. Roundup-ready soy, corn, cottonseed, canola mash, sugar beet pulp, and soon alfalfa. So a huge percentage of their food intake is Roundup-ready crops. Now remember, Roundup pulls the nutrients out of the crop. It makes them unavailable. So now we have millions of livestock eating nutrient-deficient food. And what do we eat? We eat plants and we eat animals and take their milk. So it turns out it's a perfect storm now, not just for plant disease, but for animal and human disease. When 44,000 secret FDA memos were made public from a lawsuit about the subject of genetic engineering, the director of the Center for Veterinary Medicine made it absolutely clear that GMOs in animal feed had a unique danger. Toxins can bioaccumulate in animals and in their milk. And so if there were toxins in genetically modified feed, then we might have higher levels of those toxins in the animals that eat the feed or in their milk or other products from those animals.
All our food, 90% of Canadian crops, American crops now are produced by genetic modification, or at least they're contaminated with genetically modified corn, genetically modified soybean, genetically modified everything.
95% of all the genetic modifications are done in order to allow the plants to survive more chemicals being sprayed on them and to allow the animals to survive more drugs being put into them. And of course what happens is that when their genes are changed, our genes are changed by consuming them, just as the super weeds and the super bugs are genetically altered by consuming them. The bug eats the plant, its genes change. The animal eats the plant, its genes change. We eat the animal or the plant, our genes change. Our babies' genes change, and the change is permanent.
They do not want you to know which products you're buying in the grocery store might contain genetically engineered ingredients. They say that label would confuse consumers. They say there's no difference between genetically modified foods and non-GMO foods. Well, that's absurd. That's what the word modified means in genetically modified. It is modified, it is different, and it is, in many ways, a threat to the health of the people of our nation and people around the world.
The cow receiving this hormone will actually be sick. It'll have pus in its milk because it's producing too much milk. The teat canal of the cows will get infected, will have to be treated with antibiotics.
When the Canadians were evaluating bovine growth hormone, the senior scientists there testified before the Senate that Monsanto had offered them a bribe of $1 to $2 million to approve RBGH without further study. They say documents were stolen from a locked file cabinet in the government's office, that they were being pressured to approve the drug, which they thought was of questionable safety. What we have is rigged research, hijacked regulatory agencies, where many people at the agency, at the FDA, that was approving this bovine growth hormone were from Monsanto. Monsanto's former attorney, 2 former researchers.
In the U.S., there's evidence that articles have been published that scientists who do any research on that possibly could show negative results of genetically engineered crops are harassed. They are denied funds. The universities that depend on industry money are pressured to not allow this or to discourage this kind of research.
Monsanto's own research shows that when rats were fed this Bt corn, they had signs of toxicity in the liver and kidneys. When genetically modified soybeans were fed to rodents, we've seen changes in the testicles changing from pink to blue, changes in the sperm cells, changes in the uterus and ovaries, in the DNA functioning of the embryo offspring.
In 2001, a small California biotech company called Epicite patented a gene, which causes both men and women who eat it, in the form of any product, to produce antibodies to sperm. If the men eat the Epicite gene, they produce antibodies to their own sperm, rendering them irreversibly sterile. If women eat the Epicite gene, when they have intercourse, their bodies produce antibodies to the sperm that has been deposited, and they become infertile through the destruction of the sperm. Now, DuPont and Monsanto formed a joint venture, purchased the Epicite firm, and, quote, commercialized the Epicite gene. Do you want to know if the food that you're eating contains the Epicite gene? Sure you do. How about the food that your children are eating, or your grandchildren? Sure you do.
We've seen smaller babies, a death rate that's 5 times that compared to controls. Sterile babies, even babies with hair growing in their mouths. And this has been done by government scientists as well as independent scientists who are at the top of their field.
Pay close attention to what you're about to see. These rats have been fed with transgenic corn during their entire life cycle. The tumors they suffer from are enormous.
When we look at the quality of the nutrients in our soil, we see that that has become actually a victim of industrial agriculture, which destroys the microorganisms in the soil and then puts in a few nutrients as if that were enough to provide a healthy diet.
Monsanto is the only company I know of that doesn't want you to know you're buying something that has their technology inside it. You know, cell phones, computers, automobiles, everything else we purchase, clothing, is branded because everyone wants to know, they want consumers to know that their product is inside whatever you're purchasing. But Monsanto wants that to be a secret.
They don't even want to label that this is genetically modified. The milk is genetically modified, or the crop is genetically modified. They say, if we label that, we won't be able to sell it because people won't buy it. Of course, people won't buy it because people don't want it.
The most comprehensive analysis of GMOs shows that they actually reduce yield. But sustainable technologies, they can increase yield by an average of 79%. Now, the thing about Roundup and glyphosate is that it stays in the soil for months or years, and it continues to cause the reduction of available nutrients and the promotion of these diseases. And so people like Dr. Don Huber from Purdue University, have identified more than 40 plant diseases that are on the rise in the U.S. because of the overuse of Roundup and other glyphosate-based herbicides. Now, it pulls these nutrients out of the food supply for months or years. According to Reuters, in 2007, there was about 184 million pounds of glyphosate herbicide used in the United States. Now that's one of many, many years, hundreds of millions of pounds, which means hundreds of millions of pounds of nutrients have been tied up and taken out of the food supply.
When we have a company like Monsanto that says, I don't care what nature says, I'll create the crops that I want, and we look at what happens, we see another step, another process in our own demise.
They've put spider genes into goats in the hopes that they can milk the goat to get spiderweb protein to make bulletproof vests. They've put cow genes into pigs and made cowhides on those pigs. They had what was called an enviropig, a pig that would have manure that was less toxic,
They can create these featherless chickens to kind of better live in these tight battery cages, these small barren wire enclosures extending down long rows and often windowless sheds. It can be 1 million birds in a single shed. How do you do that? Well, without them overheating, where you have this massive ventilation fans. But another way, you just take off their feathers.
There's a genetically modified salmon that was created by Canadian researchers that was tested up in Canada. They put these frankenfish into tanks and they fed them sufficient food and there was no problem. When they reduced the amount of food, the frankenfish freaked. They started killing and eating their neighbors. So what happens if the FDA approves these frankenfish and let's say they escape into the ocean? I don't know what's worse, the extinction of natural salmon or the roving of these frankenfish going around and killing and attacking other species and changing the whole ecosystem balance.
They both have a mating advantage because they're larger, but they have a survival disadvantage. And it's that combination that should a male transgenic fish escape into the wild cause the rapid collapse and extinction of both transgenic and wild fish in as little as 50 generations.
You see, GMOs are the product of an infant science. And now we are feeding that product to the entire population. And it's known to create unpredicted side effects, and no one is testing to see if the rise in all these diseases since GMOs were introduced in the mid-90s is caused or promoted by these GMOs.
There have been over 140 lawsuits filed by Monsanto against farmers, including against those farmers who wanted nothing to do with Monsanto's genetically modified seed. When you ask Monsanto whether genetically modified seed is natural, they have two answers, yes and no. And it depends on which side of Washington, D.C. they're talking. If they're at the FDA or the USDA, they say genetically modified seed is absolutely no different than natural food. It doesn't need to be tested, doesn't need to be labeled. The public doesn't need to know if their food's been genetically modified because it's no different. Then when they're on the other side of Washington, D.C. at the patent office, and the patent office is saying, well, you don't deserve a patent because your seed is no different than natural food. They say, oh no, it's not. It's completely different. We've invented something brand new. It's radically different and it's so inventive we deserve not just one patent, we deserve entire portfolios of dozens and dozens of patents.
Because the United States was the only country in the world, still is, that allowed genetically modified organisms or any organisms to be patented. Up until then, living organisms or their products could not be patented. So the patent for insulin, genetically modified insulin produced in the E. coli bacteria, was given to Eli Lilly. Monsanto got it for RBGH, the bovine growth hormone. I have a book called Corrupt to the Core. In that book, I describe, by quoting from a published speech by a Monsanto executive, saying how they're going to control the whole world, not just by genetic modification, but they're going to take charge of the whole world by influencing the White House, the Whitehall, the French Parliament, and Canadian Parliament, and the Japanese Parliament. This is published information, how they're going to control the whole world.
American people are beginning to become more aware and wake up to the fact that their government has been corrupted by corporations and the food that they're feeding themselves has possibly serious human health risks.
In the European Union, where labeling is required, there's almost no genetically engineered food on store shelves and restaurants. There's almost none of it planted.
Today, more than 50 countries around the world allow labeling of genetically engineered foods.
The FDA has received over 1 million comments from citizens demanding labeling of GMOs. 90% of Americans agree. So why no labeling? I'll give you one reason. The influence and the corruption of the political process by Monsanto.
We have increasing numbers of retarded and autistic and genetically damaged people among us. We have increasing numbers of lethal allergies and potentially lethal allergies that coincide with the introduction of genetically modified food. We have increasing amounts of autoimmune problems. We have increasing amounts of pretty much everything. The pharmaceutical industry has no interest in having you well because they don't make any money if you're well. And the pharmaceutical industry is the biotech industry, and it is the agrochemical industry.
Thousands of doctors are now prescribing non-GMO diets to every patient. In fact, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine urges all doctors to do so. They evaluated the animal feeding studies and said that there's a causal relationship between GM feed and disorders. And they urged the government to put a moratorium in place on GMOs, and of course they're for labeling.
My God, we are the sickest of the major countries in the world, and we're also becoming the dumbest of the major countries in the world. And the significance about that is, what a coincidence. This is the motivation of a government, and this is exactly where we are.
A country like the United States has 20% of its GDP spent on healthcare costs, on trying to cure chronic disease. We're giving vaccines in children. We're giving all these other drugs, bad food, pesticides, hormones, everything getting into the system in animals and people. This is going to drive countries bankrupt.
We're talking about people whose lives are either terminated through preventable diseases which were not prevented, through the toxification of their bodies by toxic food.
Total population of the world is about 7 billion now. They're saying by 2050, the population will grow to approximately 9 billion. And these companies and the governments all over the world are saying the amount of food in the world will have to be increased to twice the amount. There's no shortage of food. This is purely due to corruption, because corrupt people in power won't let poor people have their share.
Now, since GMOs were introduced, there has been a dramatic increase in infertility in the United States. But there's significant evidence both in laboratory animal feeding studies as well as livestock experience to point a finger at Roundup-ready crops as a potential cause.
The newest information of a study just published a week ago shows that these toxins in the food have actually been associated with an increased intensity of obesity, and this is found in salmon and rats. And there are other suggestions that they produce long-term imbalances in fertility rates, in hormonal levels, and immune function, and the ability to digest foods.
So these companies that are promising us to have abundant food, bring prosperity, they're lying, and the governments are with them.
I think if you really want to know the true story about what corporations are doing in our society, about the various harms and dangers that they present, you can't rely on mainstream media. You have to go deeper and you have to go further. That's going to be a very important piece in us moving forward. The fact that we do have those sources of investigation that are not beholden to corporations or corporate media, and that we do have a mechanism in the internet for disseminating them broadly.
Americans have a right to know if their food is genetically engineered. It's time for labeling. It's time for people to know how their food is being produced.
High bypass turbofan engines do not create condensation trails. And here is a bit of an explanation why. So don't be fooled, long or short, if you see a trail coming out of a jet, with very few exceptions, it's an intentional toxic chemical aerosol, also known as chemtrails. It is also sprayed over populations, and that is an inhumane act on a population, and it is a crime against humanity. Police chiefs, take notice and act to protect. So you think those lines in the sky are contrails? Think again. The trails being left in the sky by large aircraft cannot possibly be condensation trails or contrails. Once this is understood, then we are left with the ominous question, what do these trails consist of? High bypass turbofan jet engines do not create condensation trails. The ratio of the air to the exhaust is much too high to facilitate the formation of condensation because the majority of the air expelled from the back of the engine is not combusted. It is passed through the fan and simply blown out the back without mixing with any fuel at all. It's almost as if it's a propeller plane and using the jet turbine as the engine making the propeller turn around. So let me say that again. The ratio of air to exhaust is much too high to facilitate the formation of condensation because the majority of the air expelled from the back of the engine is not combusted. It is passed through by the fan and simply blown out the back without any form of mixing with fuel or any form of exhaust because of that. Turbine engines are the power plant for these high bypass turbofans. Turbine engines are used in other applications besides powering jets. They are also used to power helicopters, yet we never see trails coming from helicopters, and the reason is simple. Turbine engines almost never produce condensation trails. Simply said, every condition that is necessary for contrail formation is absent in the high bypass turbofan jet engine.